Hello, and welcome to the We're Not Stumped podcast. I'm your host, Mike Boland, and I'm a congenital amputee of the right hand. In this show, I will interview other amputees and allow them to tell you their incredible life stories. I'll also feature family members of amputees and others who support the amputee community, all in an effort to discuss the challenges and triumphs of those living with limb loss. So stick around and listen to inspirational stories and find out why we say, we're not stumped. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the We're Not Stumped podcast. My name is Mike Boland, and today I got Bruce Mezan on the podcast. I'm really excited about this episode because it is going to be, there's such a story here, and I really appreciate Bruce being on. Let me tell you a little bit about Bruce. After Bruce's freshman year of college, he took a motorcycle riding class and fell in love with riding. When his friends went on spring break, he would hop on his Kawasaki KZ400 and go on solo rides, sometimes for as long as a week. In January of 2020, Bruce received a certification from the CHP to teach motorcycle safety classes. But just a few short weeks after gaining his certification, everything changed for Bruce. I'm going to stop there because we're going to talk about what happened to Bruce and the great things Bruce is doing today on today's episode of the We're Not Stumped podcast. So first of all, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. I'm really grateful to be here.
Well, we always start the podcast with a segment we call In Your Own Words. So I'd like to hear more about your story.
Yeah, so you touched on the initial stages of it. It's interesting because I was raised in this really, I'll just say, inactive family. My father's idea of taking a chance was swimming in the deep end of a swimming pool. We just didn't participate in sports. So I went off to school. I went to UCSB in UC Santa Barbara in 1980. And I went a little bit crazy on the physical side. I got involved with fighting fires for the Forest Service. I got my EMT cert and started working on a paramedic ambulance at the fire department that was on campus, serving the campus and in the community. Started skydiving. And one of the things I got interested in was motorcycles. And I'd never ridden one. And I bought one. And I took safety classes. And as you said, I traveled and enjoyed it. And I kept this behavior up all the way to the point when I got hurt. I had a motorcycle that I traveled on, and I would take off on these long solitary journeys. I'd end up in Colorado or Utah or go down in Mexico, almost always alone. I like to travel alone. I liked not having other people's agendas, even agendas for myself. I just like to wander. But I always took the riding really seriously. I always wore the gear, and I had a range secretly painted out at a local college in the parking lot. And I'd go there 4 or 5 days a week and set up cones and just practice. I loved the technical side of riding. I just like digging into turns and really learning how to do emergency stops and how to maneuver at slow speeds. And I took a lot of clinics, advanced riding clinics and track clinics, and I really appreciated these instructors, so I'd gotten certified. And I was on my way to teach my first class. This is in the early part of 2020, February of 2020. And it was 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning, and I was riding my motorcycle, and I stopped at a four-way stop, and I looked to my right, and as far as I could see, it was clear. And I proceeded into the intersection, and I was broadsided. I was T-boned by a Toyota 4Runner going 50 miles an hour. So he had passed out while he was going through that intersection, and struck me. And I went flying about 25 feet and landed on my back on the sidewalk. Now, as luck would have it, this happened right outside of an Encinitas fire department. And I met with these firefighters when I got out of the hospital, and they told me the story. The firefighter said, I was in my bunk and I heard the crash, and I sat up and I looked through the blinds and I said, "Hey, Cap, something's going on out there." And he and his captain, who didn't hear it, he had his earbuds in, he was on his laptop. They grab their gear and they run out to the corner. They're so close, they don't even bring the rig out of the apparatus room. And so by the time the ambulance had gotten there, I was all worked up, and they had me all worked up and packaged up and ready to go. So when the ambulance arrived, they loaded me on my way in the ambulance and sent me on my way down to the local hospital. So by the time I got to the hospital, the surgeon had told me I'd completely bled out. There was no medical reason why my heart was still beating. I just must have an extraordinarily strong heart. And another one of the surgeons said, that I was really fortunate because this was shift change at the hospital. So he and his partner were off duty. They came back into the emergency room and they were losing me. They had to resuscitate me on numerous occasions. And it's only because it was 4 surgeons working on me instead of 2 that I survived. So it's a story of a lucky man, really, as unlucky as I seem.
Well, you use that luck for a lot of good things, but we'll get into that in a second. I was reading some of the things that you had shared with me as far as your injuries, quite an extensive list. And if it wasn't for where you got injured, not only having those additional doctors present, I can't imagine you would have lived if that didn't happen on that corner with those resources right there. Is that a true statement?
That is a true statement. That is a true statement. Yeah, my injuries were severe. I had a couple of brain bleeds and broke all the ribs in my chest. It shattered my chest. So I've got 30 pieces of hardware still in there. I lost my spleen, damaged my kidney. Lungs were collapsed and developed pneumonia and a blood infection that nearly took my life. Broke vertebrae, shattered my pelvis. Couldn't move my sound leg. And then, of course, the greatest tragedy, the hardest part is the loss of my right leg.
And is it a below knee? I think
it's below knee.
Below knee, okay. I know you spent nearly 2 months in the hospital.
Yes.
Recovering. What was that like? That had to have been tough.
The initial stages are a bit of a blur. When I came, I don't remember coming out of a coma, but I remember the sensations. I remember being lashed down, and I remember the sensation of choking. I was on a respirator, and I had an airway in my larynx, but I didn't know why. I was in immense pain, and I just remembered struggling. And I likened it to having dog brain when you pick your dog up from the vet and it's got a cone on its head. It doesn't know what happened or why. It's not thinking about prognosis. It just knows it's struggling. And this is interesting. The first cognitive memory I have is the surgeon or doctor talking to my ear and saying, "You lost your leg." And I remember in my mind, I remember this image of me like fist pumping, like going, yes, because he had told me it was below the knee. And somehow I knew that this was a greater level of mobility. What I didn't know was he had been there for the previous 5 days telling me the same thing. And on those previous days, I responded with grief and agony and pain and disbelief and suffering. It's a little bit like 50 first dates. I never met. So fortunately, the time I remember is the time where I had a sense of gratitude, because I was already obviously aware that I had a need and that this was a positive thing.
And you talk about some of the physical therapy you went through, slowly transitioning from bed to the living room to a wheelchair to a walker. That's a bigger process, and I think people that are just thrust into like a prosthetic process, it's longer than you would imagine. Is that something that you also went through?
Yeah, and the timing was difficult, because when I look back at the calendar at the day I got struck, or I should say when I look back online, the first death was being reported in the United States for COVID. So this is when COVID was still happening overseas, right? We all knew about it, but it wasn't our problem yet. But in the course of those 2 months that I was in the hospital, this is when you were all quarantined and the hospital was locked down. And they were anxious to get me out of the hospital because of the condition of my lungs. They said you wouldn't be able to manage the virus if you got it. So when I got home, the day after they took me off of my antibiotics for my blood infection, it was very insular. It was very solitary. Aside from, it's similar to what you were going through as just regular people. I was in a bed in my living room because there was a two-story house. And it was a month before I could try to use the walker, and just being in the wheelchair was very difficult because of the pain. My pelvis was shattered. And I remember after that first month getting up with a walker, and I was so weak. I had lost 40 pounds. I was 40 pounds lighter than I am now. And I would try to do a lap around the island in the kitchen and then go lay down. And it was just such a long journey before I finally started the prosthetic process, because I had to get to a point where I could maneuver.
Yeah, your body had to heal with all those injuries. Your entire body had to heal.
Yes,
So
that's right.
what was that initial process like? You talk about it in some of the notes that I have about you, about I think you first got your initial leg and then started progressing and getting to where you are now. What was that process like?
So, and a lot of your listeners understand the process of getting fit for a prosthetic, of course. And so we were making a test socket. And I remember sitting there in the wheelchair, and he said to me, "Now, Bruce, when you stand up, this is going to be uncomfortable for your first time." And I didn't think much about it because pain was kind of my constant companion. Like I wasn't, it didn't really register. And I stood up, and the pain was off the charts. It was so incredibly painful. And he walked out of the room for a moment, the prosthetist, and I said to my wife, "If it hurts like this, I'm not going to be able to do it." And it turned out that the fibula, which is a small bone in the lower leg, is disarticulated, it's dislocated, it's sitting beside the knee. So it felt like if your finger is dislocated, it's okay when it's in a splint, but if you move it, it's incredibly painful.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't do a good enough job communicating the pain because he had warned me it would be uncomfortable and everything hurt. So this was normal for me. And it really made that first year and a half a huge struggle to try to get comfortable in a prosthetic and learn to walk. So that was the first time on my feet. But what was profound about that day was that first time I stood up and I looked down, just as if you're just now, even with a prosthetic, you see the line of sight is such that you see your knees, you don't see your lower leg, and you see your feet. And so when I stood up with that prosthetic, I couldn't see the prosthetic. I just saw my knee and I saw my foot. And I remember being confused, like my brain was toggling back and forth between like I'm full again and I lost my leg, and it was a moment I'll never forget. It's a little bit like the clouds started to part and the sun started shining through. Like there was hope. I could understand a way forward because, I mean, one thing I think about is to lose your limb, it messes with your identity, obviously. And so as I lay in bed and I look at my limb, this disfigured version of myself, and I'm way rooted in the physical between my work running construction sites. I didn't hesitate to jump in a trench or climb a roof. I would go to the track on my motorcycle. I skied, I snowboarded, I surfed. And so now what does this mean? And then I think about my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, my fiance. What if she finds me grotesque? Like, what about intimacy?
Yeah.
And so this was like the first shift where I can imagine a way forward. And it was really a special moment for me.
You talked about the pain and a year and a half, I think you said, that going through a lot of that. If you were going to go back, or if there was a lesson learned, and we're going to talk a lot about the lessons that you've learned and the amazing things you're doing now. But a lot of amputees talk about the advocacy and the self-advocacy. Would you have said something sooner? Is that something you would share with others to say, hey, this seems like it hurts a little bit too much? Or is there any learnings from that?
Yes, there is. And in fact, my prosthetist, same process I have now, reminds me of that day. And speak up and let me know, and you got to communicate more. And of course you have to, I mean, that's a huge lesson for me, is to be very, very clear, because their bar is quite high. My prosthetist bar is quite high. He wants you to be comfortable and mobile and not accept sores or pain. And in fact, we worked very, very hard once I was clear with him to come up with a socket that's very comfortable for me. It's very comfortable. Now I put on a different socket that I might use, that might be more mobile. In other words, it's not maybe as restrictive, as supportive as this, and I'm in pain again. So these guys can work magic, if you communicate well, for sure.
Absolutely. And you go through Hanger, is that correct?
I do.
Yeah, that's where we met, at a support group.
That's right.
And I really enjoyed it, and I was very honored, to be there. And I actually knew some of the same people you do, so it was great doing that. They do a lot of great things.
They do.
What is your feeling towards the support groups? Is that something that was a big part of your journey as well, getting through?
Yeah, and I recommend them, but what I find is that if the support group doesn't fit your vibe, don't stay with it. So, for example, I was involved in a support group, not with amputees, but more trauma victims, and they were angry. And the sessions were used to
Mm.
talk about how the court system failed them and how the police system failed them. And I didn't experience that. I didn't, and the doctors, and I just didn't experience that at all. And it wasn't a fit. Um, Getting involved with Hanger and Christy Atha's group was a light because people are positive and they're moving forward and they're upbeat, and it fit. It made sense. So the support groups are very, very good, but it's important that it fits the place you are at. And so you might move on from this place of anger, and that group that served you before, move on and find something where it's more of a fit for the place that you're at.
I'm really glad you brought that up. In all the podcasts that I've done, I don't think I've heard that philosophy, but it's one I agree with quite a bit myself, because there can be, we're all human, so maybe other people are either in different parts of their journey or just have different ideas about whatever in life. And there have been times where I've been around others where it's like, especially like others like me, it's like, that's kind of not the way I feel.
Right.
It's okay for us to have our own opinions. And I agree with you too with what Christy does. And I believe there was a special guest the night that I was there, Leslie Green,
Yes.
and
Mhm.
she does a great job. I think she usually, she's not there locally because I think she's more from the Midwest. But is she
Yeah.
usually there via Zoom, or was it a combined?
She's not on the call that I'm in. I do Christie's regularly, but I've spoken to her at length on the phone about the groups and about mentoring, which I've been doing to recent amputees, and she's remarkable. I mean, she creates families in her groups, and it's amazing to behold.
Yeah, I was so impressed with being at that group. So if anyone is interested, certainly reach out to me. I'll try to get more information about that particular group. Another gentleman that we both know, Dan Moses, is in that
Yes.
group. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of great things there. And you said you are a mentor now.
Yes.
What does that mean for you?
It's been really interesting to learn how to approach people. The reason I do it is because I found that in the hospital, and again, this was during COVID, so it may not be fair, but in the hospital, there was very little attention to my life as an amputee. It was all about the medical concerns. It was about
Wow.
my sound leg, which wasn't moving, or the wound care on the amputation.
Wow.
But there was nothing to deal with the shift in identity that was occurring. And so I wanted to be able to answer questions. I thought, what if I'm just that buddy that they have that they can call and say, hey, you've been through this. So it's an introduction of who I am, what questions you have, what concerns. It's not about me. I don't spend time on my story unless they want to hear something about it. So it's not like the example of, hey, everything's going to be great. There's no presentation of silver linings. It's just being there. And if they have questions or concerns or want to talk about things or something that, you need to stay in your lane. If it's therapy, oriented, it's maybe trying to find a resource for them. It's important to stay in your own lane, but it's really just being someone that can relate to maybe what they're going through.
You were talking about your story, and you're there to listen and not necessarily tell your story. I'm very blessed that you're on this podcast sharing your story, because there is more to this story that is just hits me in the heart, and it has to do with the gentleman that hit you. And it's a whole nother, it's just a whole nother story. You have done things to find out more about him and know about his life. I don't want to steal any of that from you. I'd like to hear from, I'd like our listeners especially to hear some of the things that you've done in going to the prison and meeting with this person and all of that.
Yeah, let me back up and talk a little bit about his involvement in what happened.
Yes, thank you.
He was working at a restaurant, and he worked the night before the crash, and he got invited to a party by a girl who was house sitting for her aunt and uncle. And he goes to this party, and he gets very, very drunk. And his friends recognize it. They take his keys. He didn't want to stay the night because he had a breakfast shift in the morning, and he didn't have a uniform. They found him a uniform, and they get him to crash out on the sofa. He goes to sleep, and all is well. And a couple hours later, the girl who's hosting the party goes down to check on him, and he's gone. So he left the house while he was still impaired. And as I said, ran through that intersection, T-boned me, broadsided me, and kept going another maybe 100 feet or so, and pulled half on the sidewalk, half on the street. His truck, his Toyota 4Runner, was totaled, and he takes off on foot. He runs, and he ducks into the bushes down an adjacent street. And at that same time, one of the neighbors was coming out and to investigate. They heard the crash, and he sees him in the bushes. He's squatted down and he's on the phone. He's actually calling his mother. And this man approaches him and says, "Hey, are you going back?" And he said, "Going back where?" He said, "Are you going back to the crash?" And he stands up and he walks out of the bushes and says, "Yeah, I messed up." And at that point, they bring him back to the scene. Walks him back to the scene, and the deputies were there at that point. They could tell he was drinking, and they arrested him. So he was ultimately sentenced to 4 years and 4 months in state prison. So when I got out of the hospital, like I knew, or even when I was in the hospital, I knew I wanted to use this experience to help people. And from what I understand, it's not that uncommon for people to go through trauma to try to add meaning to a meaningless situation, right? This isn't that unusual. And it took me a while to kind of figure that out. But beyond that, I was a little fixated on his story because I knew his life was devastated as well. He had 2 young children and a wife. And if I was honest with myself, I think back to the 20s and some of the alcohol-related decisions I made. There was a little bit of a there but for the grace of God moment for me. Like it was humbling. Like how could I? It's only by virtue of chance that the outcome was entirely different. That could have been me or any number of us who have gotten behind the wheel when we drank. And so I started speaking. I was doing, speaking for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But I was really interested in integrating his story because I felt like that's what happens to you if you drink and drive. Like maybe that's a more poignant story because I'm a degree removed, but the wreckage to his life is maybe as significant as from a storytelling standpoint, because if you can buy into the notion that we're all selfishly motivated, maybe that's as important. So I decided I wanted to meet him, and I reached out to the Department of Corrections, and there's a program. It's called the VOD program, Victim Offender Dialogue. And I will go through this long process I won't bore you with of approval.
I'd never heard it. That's why when I read it, I'm very.
So the intent is to help both victim and, in fact, the prisoner or offender to seek closure, right? It's not just one-sided, but that's why it's there. And it's, from what I understand, and I don't know the exact statistics, maybe in the state, maybe it's done 5 or 10 times a year, but much more commonly amongst juveniles. It's very common amongst juveniles to help them reconcile with the victim of their offense, whatever it may be. So I get assigned to 2 facilitators. Once I'm approved and I'm cleared, and this young man who struck me is approved and cleared, he has to agree to it. It's voluntary. And so after about 9 months, and this is a little over a year ago, I traveled to the prison with these 2 facilitators, and we get checked into the prison. And the 2 facilitators go in the room, and I went to use the restroom. When I came back, the young man who struck me, he's there, and they're shaking hands and introducing themselves to each other. And he turns to me and he starts walking to me, and he holds out his hand to shake my hand, and we shook hands. And it's the only other time our eyes met was during the sentencing hearing when I read my victim impact statement to him. And it was such a strange moment because if you strip away his shame and guilt and my anger and my resentment, pain, like there were 2 human beings who our lives are forever interconnected. It's really hard to add words to this, but it was like it's 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 like my story will never not include him and his will never not include mine. We felt interconnected, right? It was just this very strange feeling, and I think we both felt it. And he started backing up, and all of a sudden he got very uncomfortable, and he looks up at me. He's looking at the ground, and he looks up as we're backing up to find our seats, and he said, "I'm sorry." And it was a strange moment because it felt like an understatement. And I'm not judging because I don't know if I could have said anything better, but it's what we say when we bump shopping carts, right? It's a strange moment. So we sat down and I jumped right in. I didn't wait for facilitators to do their introduction. And I told him I was there. I wanted to build my story. I wanted to understand the devastation in his life, because I want to relay it to DUI offenders who I speak to monthly, and anyone else. I want them to understand like how the wreckage. And so he started talking about his life right away. He was very agreeable. We talked about prison and what that was like, about being in county jail during COVID. And I'll say this part's interesting to me because it helped me understand his mindset and the work he was doing. He said it was hell in there. He said you were never let out of your cell. We had to learn to bathe using the toilet. And he said there were people around me losing their minds. I was losing my mind. I wrote you a letter to ask for your forgiveness, and they wouldn't let me send it because we're in the middle of a criminal case, right? No communication. And in fact, even still, we're not allowed to really be communicating because he's on parole. And they wouldn't let me send it. I had no choice but to either lose my mind or forgive myself. And I chose to forgive myself, which is kind of a profound thing to say. And I know he wasn't making that, because it's not something you'd say to a victim to ingratiate yourself, right? But it said he's doing the work. He talked about his drinking. He started drinking at a very young age, and continued all the way through to when he graduated from high school. Went to work at the restaurant. The culture there was alcohol related. They were all drinking, him and his friends, and it was just natural. It was just, he kept using the word natural. It was his word for normalization. It was just normalized. And he started buying a pint of vodka every day and secretly drinking it. And his mother and his wife knew he had a problem, convinced him to go to AA, but he said it would make me angry. Whenever they'd get after me, and I'd go to AA, but I was just angry about it because I knew I had it under control. He said, but look what I've done. Look what I've done to your life and to my life and my kids. I asked him about his family, and I knew they lived in the same town that I live in. And he said, well, my wife and my two kids moved on your street, across the street from you. They moved in with her parents. And I said, how can I not know that? How can they live on my street? Because I learned to walk up and down my street for months. That was my path of travel. Wow. He said, well, she sees you at the market. There's a local market two blocks away. She sees you at the market, but hides her face and sneaks away. And the kids are told not to go don't go near him because he might be angry. Wow. And I started thinking immediately about family trauma and how these things rip the family apart, right? Or maybe like in this case, a young kid doesn't know dad's in prison. It's a secret. The older kid does. What happens later? Or, it skips generations. I mean, we all know stories of how these things kind of keep surfacing up. And I said, listen, if she ever sees me, have her come and say hi. I promise I'll treat her with kindness. And if I ever meet the children, I'll treat them with kindness and love. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, I'm coming out of that market. And she's there with her two kids. She's holding the 3-year-old in her arm, and the 11-year-old's kind of tucked behind her. She introduces herself. She said, I was leaving, but I decided to come back and meet you, which is courageous, right? Yeah. It's crazy. And so we small talked for 15 or 20 minutes. And as we said goodbyes, I said, hey, I had a great visit with your husband. He was very open and forthcoming, and I just want nothing but good things for you and the family. And she said the same thing. And a couple of weeks later, I'm at the same market with my wife. I'm there with my dog. We're at the same center. And she comes up again, and she's got the 11-year-old with her this time, and said, my daughter saw you from across the parking lot and wanted to meet your dog. Which, it sounds inconsequential, right? But it's there's like just a sweet little story, but it kind of gives you hope. Like maybe there's some way forward, especially juxtaposed against what, the fear they were in, and avoid this man. And I don't know. It's just a, I don't know. It gives me hope that along the lines of what he said in prison, some of these other things he said that gave me hope that maybe there's a shift in identity. He had said that this is the first time he remembers not drinking alcohol. And he said, I know myself for the first time. This is when we were in prison. He was saying this. I like myself and I know I'm a good man. And he has goals. He wants to get out and become a captain with the Department of Forestry and run inmate crews because he's fighting fires for the Forest Service as an inmate. We had a lot to talk about that because in my youth, I worked for the Forest Service, and I worked fires with inmate crews. And so I understood his world as well. And I don't know, it's just, as a victim, it's much more not satisfying, but comfortable to be in this place of righteous indignation, right? To call him a monster, to demonize him. But regardless of how I feel about him, he's getting out. And 95% of the prisoners get out. And if they're identifying as this just monster or villain or offender or whatever, there's a better chance of recidivism. I mean, in other words, I'm interested in his reintegration, and part of that is lifting shame. And I can't say that if he came across as a bad man, I'd feel the same way. But there's a man in there who's trying to connect with goodness. And I have an opportunity, I feel like a responsibility to help him do that.
Yeah, that's just an incredible story. I think most people, I don't know what the stats would say, but I bet a lot of people wouldn't do what you did. Mm-hmm. And then to have the attitude that you have, you're almost you're rooting for his success.
Yeah.
What a great story. And I read something that you had sent me about, I think you asked the question, what if someone would have tried to tell you, hey, you got to stop your drinking? I think his answer was, at that point in my life, no one was going to tell me.
Right.
Something along those lines.
Yes, that's right. You said, yeah.
So hopefully this is something that gets him on the straight and narrow. You also introduced a new term for me, PTG, which is post-traumatic change, which, and as you wrote, it's
post-traumatic growth.
Growth. Okay. I'd love to hear more of that.
So it's so interesting to me. This is kind of a new realization for me, maybe a couple months ago. We all know post-traumatic stress, right? We're all very aware of it, and it's real. It's in the media. It's in our fabric. And I was talking to someone, actually just a therapist, not in therapy, but someone I had met. I was talking about all my thoughts that are swimming around in my head about the changes I experienced, and I really honestly thought it was due to like the peek behind the curtain, right? Near-death experience. I came out a different man. He said, well, that's post-traumatic growth. And we kind of continued on, but I made a mental note, got home, started Googling it. And it's so interesting. It's maybe an area of psychology that might be 20, maybe 30 years old. And it basically says that as much as we know about post-traumatic stress, maybe 20% of people who go through trauma go through prolonged or some version of post-traumatic stress. And the trauma is self-defined, right? What's traumatic for you might not be for me. So that's irrelevant. But half to 2/3 of the people who go through some trauma experience significant growth. And there's 5 domains, and they're like an awareness of new possibilities, enhanced relationships with others, increased personal strength, appreciation of life, and maybe some spiritual or existential growth. It's not all 5. It's not independent of post-traumatic stress. They can happen at the same time. It can just be one of those things. And I thought, oh, this is a great framework to recognize the reshaping that I've gone through, and that many of us have gone through, who have been through something that's traumatic. And it was really helpful to become aware of that. And I thought back of some of the things I experienced, like like, so as a child, I moved around a lot. We lived in 3 different states. I went to 8 different schools by the time I was in
Oh
high
wow.
school. And that's not traumatic in and of itself. But for me, I became like reclusive. I stopped trying to be social and meet people. And I carried that relationship with the world into adulthood. And I kind of, at the essence of it, didn't really believe I mattered a whole lot. I still went through the motions and had love in my life and family and all that, but I just didn't. I just carried that attitude. And when I was in the hospital, I had so many people coming and seeing me. My daughter had traveled from overseas, living overseas, traveled and stayed for 6 months. People at work who I thought were acquaintances been to the hospital 10 or 12 times to see me. I'd have hundreds of visitors, and the room was filled with relatives and friends and family. It made it impossible for me to land on this conclusion that I didn't matter. It dismantled it. So, in the most painful, darkest moment in my life, it brought some beauty in it. Like it really changed it. And so it took me a while to figure out that really this is a lot of the change I've gone through in my life from this is really because a lot of these perceptions I had were dismantled. We can develop these ideas from our youth or from any point in our life, and we go through our lives sometimes pulling out the pieces of the truth that support this hypothesis and sort of dismissing all the rest, which I'd done my whole life.
Wow.
And only in this most catastrophic moment was my truth reshaped.
Was that the inspiration for you to take what you had gone through and then do the speaking that you're doing now? Is that part of that as well?
I just remember coming home from the hospital knowing I wanted to do it. And I remember when I came home, I called my DA and said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we did like some type of video, like with both stories, right? And this goes out to middle schools and they could see the devastation of his life and how it interacts with mine. And he's like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes here, big guy. We're in the middle of a criminal case. They're going to want probation. They're going to want something in exchange, but keep the idea. Um, all this was sort of just happening without me knowing where the source was. Yeah, I can't think of what inspirations were. Talking a little bit about that, when I was with this young man in the prison, I had this in my head because it's still sort of the high bar of what I'd want to achieve. And I said, hey, would you do me a favor? Would you write out for me what your experiences were? I want to be able to share this with an audience because I felt like that would be too intimidating to ask for. And he said this, he said, well, I know there's things you want to say or ask, but are afraid to, which wasn't true. And he said, and there's things I want to say that I'm reluctant to as well. And I said, dude, anything you want to say? And he said, well, I told my mom that I wanted to, when I got out of prison, speak at her church. What if Mr. Mezan, me, and I got up on the stage together and we told both parts of our story? And I said, man, if we do that, we can really make changes. And I said, but the trick is we can't get up there as with tension. We got to be okay. And he understood, and that's sort of that bar is still there for me. Is doing something together.
And hopefully that happens. But even so, in the time that during this time, you've still gone out and you've talked to high schools and many places. So if anyone wants to get a hold of you, we're going to have a link to your email address if anyone wants to have you speak at their event to share this story, this incredible story. What are some of the things that you didn't realize what it's like to be as an amputee that you now know going through your experience?
I might have a little different perspective, and it might be it's my truth, but I feel like being out in the world, like I always wear my leg exposed, and part of it is because of the size of my socket. It's hard to get pants over them. That's where it started. But I feel like because I get to wear, well, let me say this. When someone cuts you off in front of this in the supermarket accidentally in line, and you go, blah blah blah. You don't know. Is her house being foreclosed on? Did she just lose her
Yeah.
husband? Did she just get a diagnosis?
Yeah.
But I get to, in a way, wear my pain, right? It's out there, and I'm not saying I I get to see a softer side of humanity, and it isn't sympathy or pity because I know what that looks like. I've seen that and I've experienced it. But I think that people are a little bit more vulnerable when they meet you. Um, I think I see like men. We drop our guard a little bit when we see someone who's been through something. I see a more beautiful side of humanity than I saw otherwise. And so I wouldn't have expected that. And so I like that. I feel like I got a key to a back door. I get to experience something differently than other people do.
And what is next for you? What are you looking forward to? You talked about possibly getting together with the young man and doing some talking. Is there anything else that you're looking forward to as you continue? Are you back on a motorcycle? I think that's a good question to ask.
No, motorcycles were great, and a lot of the things that I did were great because there's something about exploring yourself through fear, like doing things you don't want to do or are afraid to do, and then having yourself do it and learning about yourself. And I've had a life of doing that. Um, I won't get back on it. And I have a friend who was an instructor at one of the tracks, and in fact, I just saw him yesterday, and he wants me to get back on a motorcycle, but I'm not comfortable doing it. And I think it's because it's real to me that something can happen. So, for example,
Yeah.
when we go out surfing, we know we're re-entering the food chain at a lower level, right? Or we go backpacking. I believe there's sharks out there now. Like I know that sharks can bite me. So I won't ride again. But I can still explore fear through other things like public speaking. I mean, it's
Yeah.
an intimidating thing to do, right? And so it's sort of the same sensation in some way, but it's not. You're not putting your life on the line anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Go ahead.
what I'd like to do is continuing my thinking and exploring um, the speaking, but maybe on more of an inspirational level. And we've talked a little bit about that offline, transitioning away from the scared straight or um, the scared straight story, cautionary tale to some of the lessons I've learned. And so it's to speak. I would like to continue on with the speaking.
I remember in high school, we're close to the same age, I would imagine. They'd have those driver's ed videos where they showed some really interesting things, and I think
Right.
even those high schools have gotten away from doing that.
Yes, I don't think it works.
I think your approach, as you think now, is probably the best way. Because your story is real. That is such a real story. And I
Yeah.
want to ask you. Oh, go ahead. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, when I speak to DUI offenders every month at the courthouse, it isn't the cautionary tale. It's really about identity. It's about reshaping their identity and the choices they make, the risks they take, and that maybe not recognizing or discerning between the bad things that happen that are based on choices and the bad things that happen that don't. Like I'm an example of something bad that happened that wasn't by choice, but I try to get them to understand that somewhere in the lineage of events that got them in that room, in that courthouse, there's a decision they made that got them there. And there's a lot of, it's kind of good news because if we can eliminate these poor decisions, life gets a lot easier. And that's not a dark story. I mean, that's focusing on their humanity.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. There's one other question I do want to ask because you had
Yeah.
talked about it a little bit, and I want to make sure I have it right. So I may not have the story exactly right. You were dating when this happened, and then now you are married. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That what kind of process? Because you did talk about it a little bit. You're now you're with someone, and as you said, now you're disfigured. That in itself, right there, is another, especially mental process. How
Yes.
I would imagine this person is very accepting, and everything went well. Obviously, you're married, but what was
Yes.
that process for you?
Um, Leading up to it, we'd been together for probably 5 years and living in the same home when I got hurt. And the lead up to that time was, and we talked about being married. but I was anxious to be married because I wanted to have, and I couldn't quite identify what it was, but I wanted to have the sense of family or the roots or the things of that, in my mind at the time marriage brought. And during the time in the hospital, she really stepped up. Like she went to my children and said, look, I mean, she could have gone to them and said, look, it's your dad. I'll be here if you need, but it's your dad and it's your deal. She was there like a vigil always. And then when we got home, I said to her, I remember being in the bed and saying to her, like, I want to get better. I just want to give you your sweet life back. And she looked at me and said, look, I just want you. I just want you to love me. I just want to be able to love you. I just want us back. And it just made it clear, like the marriage became very symbolic at that point. I wasn't trying to recreate anything. It was just about a recognition of the love and the symbolism and the beauty of it. And so, and we've been married for maybe 6 months now. So it's very recent.
Well, thank you for allowing me to ask that question. I kind of threw that one at you at the end, but it seemed like, I mean, these are the things that's as real life as anything. Everything you talked about was real life, but even the relationship aspect when it comes, employment is another thing that comes up a lot with amputees. And one thing I say about because I've had that question asked to me, hey, did you have problems dating when you were younger? And because I was born with one hand, and I always said, hey, listen, if there's a person that doesn't want to date me because I have one hand, well, I probably don't want to date. I don't want to date anybody that doesn't want to date anybody with one hand. It's kind of one of those things. And again, we talked about what's next for Bruce. I'm going to put your email address on. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story today. It's one of hope. Yes. I'm sure you hear that a lot, but it's one of hope, not only for the amputee community, but for someone who may have made a mistake in their life and you forgive them and you're the biggest fan of them being a success. It's quite a story and maybe something we don't hear enough about in today's world. I just can't thank you enough for being on the podcast today.
It's been a real pleasure.
That was the We're Not Stumped podcast, hosted by Mike Boland. If you want to be a guest on the program, reach out to Mike at his email address, mike@mikeboland.com. This podcast is produced by One Hand Man Productions. If you are looking to start your podcast, go to onehandmanproductions.com.